Hello ladies, have you ever wondered what happens in someone's mind when you go silent? Not for a day, not for a week, but for months. Not a goodbye, not a closure, just quiet. That kind of silence doesn't fade, it echoes. It lingers in the corners of their thoughts, whispering questions they never knew they had to answer. At first, he thinks it's peace, then confusion creeps in, then memories begin to replay, on loop, like unfinished sentences searching for an ending. Because silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's the presence of everything that was left unsaid. And while you're gone, his mind doesn't rest. It rewinds, it replays, it rethinks. Every word, every moment, every glance becomes a clue. He starts to wonder, was it something he said, something he didn't say, or was silence always meant to come? Like a test from the universe, asking him to face himself without distraction. That's where the real story begins. Not when you left, but in the moments after, when your silence became the loudest voice in his world. When you go silent for months, his world doesn't stay still, it trembles quietly. At first, there's confusion. He replays every word, every moment, every message that ever passed between you. He wonders what he said wrong or what he failed to say at all. Silence becomes a puzzle he tries to solve in his own mind, a riddle with no ending. Days turn into weeks, and that silence begins to echo. It echoes in the places you once spoke, in the music you both shared, and in the moments he thought were forever. He starts to realize that silence isn't just the absence of words, it's the presence of everything left unsaid. Some nights he tries to fill that silence with noise, work, friends, distractions, anything to mute the memories. But silence is clever. It finds its way back, whispering in the quiet hours when the world sleeps. It asks questions he's not ready to answer, and slowly, confusion turns into reflection. He begins to understand that maybe silence isn't punishment, maybe it's protection. Maybe it's teaching him something about himself that he was too busy to notice before. He starts to see where he lost himself trying to keep something alive that was already fading. The silence becomes a mirror. It shows him his flaws, his impatience, his mistakes, but also his strength. It forces him to rebuild, not around you, but within himself. He learns that sometimes silence is the only voice that tells the truth, and one day, that silence no longer hurts, it becomes peace. He stops asking why you went silent, and starts understanding what the silence gave him: clarity, maturity, and the courage to stand alone. Because sometimes the loudest conversations happen in the quietest moments. And what happens in his mind during your silence is not just loss, it's transformation. When you go silent for months, something changes inside him, something he doesn't talk about, something he doesn't even understand at first. It's strange how silence, something so quiet, can make such a loud noise inside a person's head. It's not just the absence of your voice he feels, it's the weight of everything that voice once carried. Comfort, chaos, laughter, pain, and truth. In the beginning, he tries to convince himself it's temporary. He tells himself she's just busy. Maybe she needs space. Maybe she'll come back. But deep down, he knows silence doesn't visit without a reason. It creeps in when words have failed, when emotions have burned out, when distance has already begun long before anyone noticed. His mind becomes a battlefield of memories. Every conversation turns into a replay. Every silence into a question mark. He wonders if he was too distant or too close, too cold or too emotional. He tries to balance logic and emotion, but silence doesn't play fair. It tilts the scale until everything feels heavy, uncertain, unfinished. At night he scrolls through old messages, not to read them, but to remember the feeling behind them. He listens to songs that once meant nothing, and suddenly, they mean everything. He starts reading between the lines of things that were never written, because that's what silence does. It makes you hear what was never said and feel what was never shown. It's not that he's obsessed, it's that he's haunted. haunted by what once felt permanent, now fading like mist in the morning light. And as the days stretch into weeks, that silence begins to speak louder than any argument ever could. It tells him things he doesn't want to admit, that maybe he mattered more to himself in the story than he ever did in hers. It whispers, maybe it's not her silence that hurts. Maybe it's your attachment to the noise she once made in your life. He doesn't tell anyone what's going on in his mind, because how do you explain missing something that doesn't even speak back? So he carries it quietly, the questions, the memories, the ache. He carries it not because he's weak, but because silence doesn't give you closure, it gives you echoes, and you learn to live inside them. And somewhere between missing her and moving on, between wanting answers and accepting none, his mind starts to shift slowly, painfully, but surely. The tone inside him shifts quietly, but deeply. It's no longer confusion. It's something heavier, quieter, and deeper. There's a storm, but it doesn't roar, it hums beneath his ribs. A storm that doesn't destroy, it teaches. A storm that doesn't shout, it reminds him how fragile peace really is. He starts to feel everything at once: anger, sadness, regret, and sometimes nothing at all. That's the strange part about silence. It doesn't just take away sound, it takes away certainty. He begins to question not only you, but himself. Every choice, every word, every moment that once felt right now feels blurred, as if silence took the color out of the memories and left them in shades of gray. He learns how heavy time becomes when no one speaks your name. He learns that nights can feel endless when there's no good night, and mornings can feel empty when there's no message waiting. It's not heartbreak, it's hollow space, the kind that doesn't scream or bleed, but simply exists quietly, eating away at him from within. Yet, even in the silence, emotions begin to take shape in ways words never could. He starts realizing that pain is not just something you feel, it's something you learn to live beside. It becomes his companion, invisible, patient, and always there. And that tone inside him, the deep, emotional one, starts narrating everything. The way he walks, the way he breathes, the way he stares too long at nothing at all. Sometimes he wants to scream, to break the silence, to beg for one word, one reason, one sign that he still exists in your world. But then he stops. Because silence also teaches restraint, it shows him that some questions deserve no answers, and some closures never arrive wrapped in words. So he swallows the urge to reach out. He learns to sit with the ache, to let it pass through him like wind through broken glass. Painful, yes, but strangely cleansing. And as days pass, something inside begins to whisper, not the echo of her voice, but the voice of his own soul, the one he never used to hear when her words filled the room. It's soft, almost fragile, but it's his. It says, feel this, don't run from it. This is how you rebuild, not with noise, but with stillness. The silence that once felt like punishment begins to feel like a teacher, a quiet, unrelenting one. It forces him to face what's within his insecurities, his fears, his dependence on someone else's presence to feel whole. And slowly, painfully, he realizes the person he's been waiting to hear from might actually be himself. Inside his mind, it's not quiet, not even close. It's a maze, a constant replay of what was, what could have been, and what will never be again. Every corner of his mind carries a version of you, a memory laughing, another one fading, another one asking questions he can't answer. He walks through them all again and again, like a ghost visiting the ruins of something he once called peace. He overthinks everything: the last text, the last call, the tone of your last goodbye, even the pauses between your words that day. He wonders if those pauses were hints, warnings, or silent farewells disguised as hesitation. His mind becomes an editor, cutting and reassembling every moment, trying to find a reason that will finally make the silence make sense. But there's never a perfect reason, only pieces that don't fit anymore. He feels trapped between logic and emotion. Logic tells him to move on, but emotion whispers, wait, maybe there's more. So he waits not for you, but for understanding. For the day his mind will stop creating stories that end in what if. There's a constant noise in his thoughts, not from the world outside, but from the echo of your absence inside him. It's strange how silence can create its own sound, a hum that lives somewhere between missing and acceptance. He tries to silence it, but the more he fights it, the louder it becomes. He starts analyzing himself, his patterns, his faults, the things he could have done differently. And sometimes he blames himself for everything, because when silence arrives, the mind becomes its own courtroom, and he is both the judge and the accused. Every sleepless night feels like a trial, every thought feels like evidence, and guilt becomes the only thing that speaks fluently in that quiet. But even in that storm, there's a strange kind of awakening. He begins to see the difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness hurts because it's forced upon you, but solitude heals because it's chosen. And though he doesn't realize it yet, this silence is slowly pushing him from loneliness to solitude, from obsession to observation, from need to understanding. He begins to understand that maybe it was never just about losing someone, maybe it's about finding what parts of himself were lost while trying to hold on. Inside his mind, silence starts painting new images, not of what he lost, but of what he might become once he stops running from the quiet. He doesn't say any of this aloud. He smiles when people ask how he's doing, because they wouldn't understand that silence isn't empty, it's overflowing. Overflowing with memories, emotions, realizations, and questions. And he carries them all, not because he wants to, but because he has to. Because that's what happens in his mind when you go silent for months. The war doesn't stop. It just goes underground, where every thought, every memory, and every heartbeat becomes another unanswered letter he writes to the quiet. And still, the silence continues. Stretching between what was and what might still come, a space he can't escape, yet somehow doesn't want to leave. Pain arrives first. Not the kind that breaks bones or draws blood, the kind that hides beneath the skin, quiet, steady, constant. It's the ache of remembering without response, the sting of reaching out in thoughts that never make it into words. He doesn't cry, not always. Sometimes the hurt is too tired to fall from his eyes. It just lives there, a weight behind his chest, pressing gently, reminding him that he once felt more alive. Then regret follows, soft at first, then heavier with every replay. He re-examines everything, the things he said too sharply, the apologies he delayed, the love he assumed would wait. Regret doesn't scream, it whispers, and those whispers are the hardest to escape because they sound like your own voice. He wonders how different things might be if he had just spoken one more time, listened one more carefully, stayed one more minute. But life doesn't hand out rewinds, only echoes, and echoes can't hold you when the night feels too long. Confusion ties itself to all of this. It moves through him like fog, thick, unkind, and without direction. He asks questions the silence refuses to answer. Was it my fault? Was it fate? Was it ever real? The mind becomes a carousel of maybes, spinning endlessly, each thought chasing another until they all blur together. He tries to reason with emotions that have no language, and every attempt to understand just opens another door to what he doesn't know. And yet, somewhere between the ache and the uncertainty, realization begins to grow small, fragile, but alive. It comes not as a flash of clarity, but as a slow dawn breaking through the fog. He realizes pain doesn't mean punishment, it means presence. Regret doesn't chain you, it reminds you that you once cared. Confusion isn't failure, it's proof that you're still searching for truth. Realization begins to stitch together the torn edges of his thoughts, not to erase the silence, but to make peace with it. He starts to see that silence didn't take everything, it just revealed what was already missing. It showed him the parts of himself he ignored, the spaces he tried to fill with someone else's voice. It shows him that maybe the heart doesn't heal by forgetting, it heals by feeling, fully, painfully, completely. And even as he understands this, the emotions don't leave, they evolve. Pain becomes quieter, regret becomes softer, confusion becomes curiosity, realization becomes awareness. But nothing truly ends. Everything just changes shape, like water finding a new path after the rocks are moved. He carries all of it, the ache, the lessons, the unspoken gratitude. Because emotion, he realizes, isn't something you overcome. It's something you learn to live beside. It sits with him in silence, breathing, waiting, becoming something different each day. And still, the silence remains, not cruelly, not kindly, just there. A presence without form, a reminder that some stories don't end, they simply pause, waiting for the heart to learn the language of quiet before they can begin again. Confusion never leaves all at once. It lingers like smoke that refuses to rise. He wakes up each day with a little less certainty and a little more questioning. What used to be simple becomes layered, the laughter, the promises, even the silences that came before this silence. He looks at everything twice now, searching for meaning he might have missed the first time. It's like trying to read a book in the dark. He can feel the pages, but he can't make out the words. The emotional struggle grows quietly. It isn't dramatic. It's patient, the kind that hides in normal moments. He smiles at people, but his mind is somewhere else. He completes his routines, but inside, nothing feels routine anymore. Every song feels like a message, every memory like an unanswered prayer. He doesn't fight the silence anymore. He wrestles with himself, with the version of him that still waits and the version that wants to move on. Sometimes the struggle feels endless. He wants to understand why something that once felt so alive could fade into nothing. He wants to know why silence can hurt more than words ever did. He tries to build walls, but silence has a way of slipping through cracks. It doesn't shout, it just settles under his skin, in his thoughts, between his breaths. And yet, within that quiet battle, growth begins, almost unseen. It starts in tiny ways, in the way he stops checking his phone every few minutes, in the way he begins to enjoy the stillness of early mornings, in the way he learns to sit with his thoughts without fearing them. He doesn't realize it, but confusion is turning into clarity, and the ache is shaping itself into understanding. The lessons don't arrive as lightning, they arrive as whispers. He learns that silence doesn't mean rejection. Sometimes it means redirection. He learns that not everyone who walks away is meant to stay, and not every unanswered question deserves an answer. He learns that peace doesn't come from hearing her voice again, it comes from hearing his own and recognizing it. Growth feels strange. It doesn't erase the hurt, it gives it purpose. It teaches him to look at his pain not as an enemy, but as proof that he's capable of feeling deeply, of loving honestly, of surviving quietly. He starts to realize that clarity isn't a finish line, it's a moment, brief and fragile, where you finally see yourself without distortion. And as clarity flickers within him, he feels a kind of calm he hasn't known in months, not the kind that forgets, but the kind that forgives. He forgives the silence, he forgives the distance, he forgives himself for breaking under the weight of what he couldn't control. But even now, it isn't over. The flow doesn't end with peace, it bends back into thought. Because healing is not a straight line, it loops, it circles, it pauses. Some nights the confusion still returns, gentle but familiar, reminding him that he's still learning, still evolving, still human. And that's the truth he carries, that silence didn't end him, it refined him. It stripped away the noise, the illusions, the false certainty, until all that was left was him, raw, uncertain but real. And even as the clarity grows, there's a part of him that still listens for the sound of what once was, not to bring it back, but to remember how far he's come since it left. He used to believe silence meant absence, that when words stopped, so did meaning. But time inside quiet places rewrites that belief. He begins to see that silence isn't empty at all. It's full of lessons, mirrors, and tests that life hides in the stillness. The lesson comes first. It teaches him what noise used to hide. When life was loud, he mistook attention for affection, replies for care, conversations for connection. But silence teaches him the truth that noise can't. That love isn't proven by how much is said, but by what still remains when nothing is spoken. It teaches patience, the kind that doesn't wait for a response, but waits for understanding. It teaches him that presence doesn't always mean being near. Sometimes it means letting space breathe between two souls until both learn who they are without each other. Then comes the mirror, and it does not flatter. It reflects everything he tried not to face, the insecurities that begged for validation, the fears that made him cling to certainty, the habits that confused comfort with commitment. He sees his reflection not in glass, but in the quiet, raw, unfiltered, painfully honest. Silence has no filters, no excuses, no gentle lighting. It shows him every truth he avoided when someone else's words filled the room. He realizes that the person he was becoming in the noise wasn't the same one he wanted to be in the quiet. And then, slowly, he recognizes the test. It's not about endurance, it's about evolution. Silence tests how long he can sit with unanswered questions without building walls out of assumptions. It tests whether his love was dependence or depth, whether his loyalty was to her or to the idea of her. It tests his patience, his self-control, his faith in what cannot be seen or heard. Some days he fails the test, reaching for ghosts, reopening old wounds, trying to make sense of something that refuses to be explained. Other days he passes without realizing by simply choosing to breathe, to not reach out, to let time do the talking. The lesson, the mirror, the test, they work together quietly, shaping him in ways no conversation ever could. He learns that silence isn't a punishment, it's preparation. Preparation for the day when he can listen without fear, when he can speak without needing to be understood, when he can love without losing himself again. He starts to see silence as a teacher with endless patience. It never rushes, it waits for him to notice. Each day it hands him a small truth, about who he is when no one is watching, about what he truly values when attention disappears, about how strong the heart becomes when it has to carry itself. And even as these realizations take root, the quiet doesn't end, it just deepens. It follows him through every thought, reminding him that the absence he once feared was never absence at all, it was awareness, waiting to be heard. He doesn't speak of it, but he feels it, the subtle shift between loneliness and learning, between waiting and awakening. He begins to walk differently, not faster, not slower, just lighter, as if silence has started teaching him how to move without noise, how to find rhythm in stillness, how to breathe without needing permission. And yet, the lesson isn't over, because silence, like truth, never really ends. It only waits for the next question his heart will dare to ask. And somewhere in that waiting, his mind keeps listening for what silence will teach him next. There is no name in his memory, no single face he points to when the quiet presses in, because silence has a way of erasing labels, smoothing every edge until it becomes something larger than two people. It isn't about her or him anymore, it's about the spaces that form between hearts, the way distance stretches time, the way absence teaches every soul that attachment is just a language of its own. He stops trying to give the feeling a name. Names make things smaller, neater, easier to forget, but silence isn't small, and it never fits into tidy boxes. It belongs to everyone who has ever waited for a message that never came, to everyone who has ever carried a story that ended mid-sentence. So he lets it stay nameless, because the moment you name a hurt, you limit what it can teach you. There is no blame either. Blame would mean there was a villain and a victim, and silence is too complex for that. It's not cruelty, not kindness, just consequence. Sometimes people drift, not because they stop caring, but because life asks them to walk different roads for a while. He begins to understand that not all separations are betrayals. Some are simply pauses written into the script of becoming. The more he thinks about it, the more he realizes that pointing fingers would only trap him in yesterday. Silence doesn't respond to accusation, it only deepens. So instead of asking who is at fault, he starts asking, what am I meant to learn from this stillness? And that question changes everything. It turns pain into perspective, turns the past into a teacher rather than a wound. He starts to feel compassion, not just for the other person, but for himself, for the boy who didn't yet know how to sit with uncertainty, for the man who thought love always needed sound to stay alive. He realizes everyone is carrying something invisible, a silence of their own, and maybe, just maybe, the quiet he received was someone else's way of healing, not an act meant to break him. The universality of it humbles him. He looks around and sees the same quiet in other faces, in strangers, staring at empty coffee cups, in friends scrolling through memories they'll never post again. He understands then that silence isn't personal. It's part of the human rhythm, the inhale before the next chapter, the pause that allows meaning to settle. And with that understanding, something in him softens. No anger, no defense, no need to rewrite the story. Just acceptance, gentle, incomplete, but real. He carries the silence not as a scar, but as a shared language between souls who once met and moved on. And in that realization, his heart grows quiet too, not empty, just still enough to listen for whatever truth might follow. Reflection doesn't happen all at once, it arrives in fragments, small flashes of understanding that drift through the mind when he least expects them. In the beginning, he resists them. He wants answers, not lessons. He wants certainty, not wisdom. But reflection is patient. It sits quietly in the corners of his thoughts, waiting for the noise to settle before it begins to speak. It speaks in simple realizations, that people come into our lives to reveal parts of ourselves we could not see alone. That silence, uncomfortable as it is not punishment but permission. The universe giving him space to listen inward. It reminds him that growth is not always about becoming stronger. Sometimes it's about becoming gentler with what hurts. He starts to trace the patterns in his own behavior, the way he reached for control when things began to drift, the way he feared losing rather than understanding, the way he mistook attention for love. Each reflection is a small mirror, and though the image sometimes stings, it brings honesty. He sees that what broke him wasn't silence itself. It was his refusal to hear what silence was trying to say. Growth follows slowly, almost imperceptibly. It's there in the way he breathes before reacting, in the way he chooses calm over urgency, in the way he begins to thank the quiet instead of fearing it. He realizes wisdom isn't an answer, it's a change in the questions we ask ourselves. Instead of why did this happen to me, he begins to ask what is this teaching me, and that single shift rearranges the entire landscape of his mind. He learns that reflection is not about reliving pain, but about seeing it, finding the parts that once hurt and discovering the message buried inside. He learns that growth is not measured in distance from the past, but in the softness with which he can look back and say, I understand now. Still, he does not declare the lesson finished, because wisdom, like silence, has no end point. It expands each time he looks within. Some days the old ache still returns, gentle and familiar, reminding him that reflection is a lifelong companion. Other days, peace feels close enough to touch, but never to hold for long, and that's all right. Growth isn't meant to be held, it's meant to be lived moment by moment, breath by breath. He walks through life a little slower now, not because he's weary, but because he's listening. To the world, to his heart, to the quiet hum of understanding that rises from within. He sees how every silence, every pause, every unanswered moment has been a thread, weaving him into someone more aware, more patient, more complete. And though he still stands in the space between what was and what will be, he knows this. Reflection is not an ending, it's a beginning disguised as calm. It's the soft light that comes before the dawn, the hush before the world starts moving again, the voice that tells him, "You're learning, keep listening." And he keeps listening, letting the wisdom unfold slowly, like a sunrise that never truly ends. Time moves differently when silence enters his life. It doesn't rush like it used to. It stretches, slow, uneven, heavy in some moments, hollow in others. He starts to feel how the minutes carry weight, how each hour echoes with thoughts he used to bury beneath noise. What used to be days now feel like long corridors of memory and meaning. He counts moments not by clocks but by emotions. How long it takes for a feeling to fade, how long it lingers before it returns. At first, he mistakes time for distance. He thinks the months you've been silent mean you've drifted far away, that the lack of words equals the loss of connection. But then, slowly, he starts to notice that time doesn't erase. It reveals. Every passing day uncovers something he didn't understand before. Every night without a message teaches him to hear the unspoken. He realizes silence doesn't freeze time. It deepens it. It allows emotions to settle, memories to sort themselves out, truths to rise to the surface. Time becomes a quiet teacher, whispering what he couldn't hear when everything was loud. And as he listens, he begins to see that months of quiet don't mean forgetting. Sometimes they mean becoming. He starts to see how the heart measures time differently from the mind. The mind counts days, hours, and minutes. The heart counts changes. The softening of anger, the fading of pride, the quiet return of understanding. And while the calendar moves forward, his inner world moves in circles round and round the same moments, each time seeing them from a slightly higher view. There are nights when time feels cruel. He lies awake, trying to remember the sound of your voice, the rhythm of a laugh that used to fill the silence before it became silence itself. He replays conversations like old songs, waiting for one to sound different, but they all end in the same place, unfinished. He wonders if time is trying to heal him or haunt him, but maybe it's doing both. Because healing isn't clean. It's messy, it loops back, it stops and starts again. Time gives him that space. The messy, human kind of space where growth hides. He starts to see that the months of quiet aren't punishment. They are process. That not hearing from you doesn't mean the story is over. It means the story is being rewritten in silence. He begins to notice small things differently. The way the light hits his window, the way mornings arrive without asking if he's ready. He realizes time isn't something that passes, it's something that shapes. It shapes his thoughts, his patience, his perception of what connection really means. And in those long, wordless weeks, he finds an odd kind of rhythm, a rhythm that teaches him to breathe again without needing answers. Time starts to sound like music played from a distance. Soft, fading in and out, sometimes too faint to hear, sometimes so clear it hurts. It teaches him the beauty of pauses, the way stillness can carry more meaning than movement. And he begins to see that silence stretched over months isn't empty, it's full of moments waiting to be understood. He doesn't rush anymore. He doesn't chase closure like he used to. Because somewhere inside he starts to understand that maybe closure isn't something that happens once. Maybe it's something that keeps happening quietly each day you stay silent. He learns that time doesn't heal in straight lines. It heals in waves, in spirals, in whispers. And even as the months unfold, as seasons change, as days blur into nights, there's something inside him that keeps listening. To the ticking of the clock, to the sound of his own breath, to the way time keeps speaking even when no one else does. He realizes time isn't his enemy. It's the space between who he was and who he's becoming. It's the invisible thread that connects all silences, turning them into meaning, into memory, into something almost sacred. And though the months keep passing, and though the silence remains unbroken, he stops asking when it will end. Because deep down, he begins to feel that maybe it's not meant to. Maybe time isn't counting down to a reunion or an apology. Maybe it's counting upward, building him into someone who finally understands. He breathes, he listens, he waits, not for words, but for peace. And as he stands there, somewhere between what was and what might be, he realizes time was never the distance between two people. It was the journey one must take within. And still the silence stretches on softly, endlessly, like a sentence that refuses to end, because maybe, just maybe, the story isn't finished yet. And one day, without warning, he realizes the silence no longer hurts. It no longer feels like absence. It feels like space. The same silence that once tore him apart now holds him together. He begins to understand that healing doesn't always arrive with answers. Sometimes it arrives as acceptance. He no longer wonders what's happening in your mind, because he's too busy learning what's happening in his own. The ache that once demanded explanation has softened into gratitude for the lesson, for the quiet, for the strength he never knew he had. He smiles, not because everything makes sense, but because he finally understands it doesn't have to. Some connections end in silence, but their echoes build the person you become after them. So when you go silent for months, you don't just leave him with questions, you leave him with himself. And in finding himself, he discovers something deeper than closure. He discovers peace. Not the peace that comes from forgetting, but the peace that comes from understanding. The kind that whispers, you were meant to go quiet, so he could finally hear. And that's when the story truly begins, not with words, not with endings, but with a stillness that finally feels like home.